Welcome to Trench Diaries. This is Storm of Steel, Chapter 8, at Saint-Pierre Vaast. After 14 days in hospital and as long on leave, I went back to the regiment, which was now in the line near Deux Nerds, quite close to the well-known Grande Tranchée. After my arrival, it remained 2 days there and the same time in the old mountain town of Hatton-Châtel. Then we entrained at Mar-la-Tour for the Somme region once more. We detrained at Bohêne again and went into quarters at the village of Broncourt nearby. This was a neighborhood we often touched upon in later days. It was agricultural, and yet there was a loom in nearly every house. The inhabitants did not appeal to me. They were dirty and of very low moral development. I was billeted on a cottage where lived a man and his wife and their daughter. I must own that in return for my money they made me most excellent dishes of eggs. The daughter told me over the first cup of coffee that she was going to drink a good cup of coffee with Poincaré after his return, by which she meant give him a piece of her mind. I've never heard anyone so fluent in abuse as this Filia Hospitalis, particularly on the topic of a neighbor whom she accused of having lived in a certain street of Saint-Quentin. Ah, cette pleure, cette pomme de terre pourrie, jetée sur une fumée. C'est la crème de la crème, she spluttered while she raged round the room, stretching out her hands like claws in the vain search for an object on which to vent her wrath. In the morning, when this Rose of Broncourt was busied making butter or some other domestic matter, she looked unbelievably uninviting. Yet, in the afternoon, when it came to parading the village street with pride or visiting her friends, the ugly grub had turned into the splendid butterfly. I always observed with some mistrust a large box of rice powder that never left the table, for it seemed to me to be a complete substitute for soap and water. One day the father begged me to forward an indictment to the town major complaining of a neighbor who, not content with taking him by the throat and giving him a good beating, had shouted "Demande pardon" while threatening him with death. Little observations of this kind gave me the comforting assurance that national pride, even in France, is not a quality of the masses. 2 years later, when we returned to our native land after honorable and exacting warfare, the knowledge of this helped me to get over the remarkable reception that some of our own people gave us. Il y a des cochons partout, as the English officer had justly remarked to me in front of the trenches at Monchy. The second company was now under command of Lieutenant Boye. We spent our days here in the happy atmosphere of good fellowship. I must own that we often drank heavily until, indeed, we treated the whole world as no more than a laughable phantom that circled round our table. There were usually uproarious sounds from the room occupied by our batmen. Those who have never known the brief spells that separate one murderous battle from another may hold up their hands at us if they please. In any case, we were glad to indulge ourselves and our men with every hour of debauch that life would yield while we were still within its circle. I shall not be taken for a dipsomaniac, though I mention drink so often. I have never flouted the time-honored and social rights of the bottle. At the same time, both before the war and since, I have often gone for months without drinking at all. But at the front, one came out of the line covered with mud and in a bad temper, to have the few days on rest taken up in training, and then the night came in the mess and the present was blotted out and only memory and hope were lit up. All the devastation of every kind that surrounded one was seen in the light of humor and in a state of bliss, however fleeting it might be, and was finally lost altogether in the light-hearted independence of time that attends upon every topper. One broke through time, menacing and oppressive as it was, and rejoiced for an hour or two in a boundless world. The war left one with two memories, as I am sure every outspoken soldier of it will agree, that were always recurring. One, when one was faced with the worst moments it had to offer, the other, when the bottle went round as madly and merrily as ever it did in times of peace. It was only because these black and red threads were interlaced in fairly equal proportions that the experiences of war were not intolerable. For the coming spell in the line I was appointed as scouting officer and with a scout troop and 2 NCOs was under the orders of the division. On the 8th November, the battalion moved in pouring rain to Gornelieu. There, the scout troop was detached to Lieremont and put under the command of the divisional intelligence officer, Captain Böckelmann. The captain, with us 4 scout officers, 2 observation officers, and his adjutant, was quartered in the priest's house. There, we lived very happily together in comfortably furnished rooms. Our predecessors took over the divisional front. We had to go up the line every second night. Our task was to ascertain where the front line ran and to see that communications were maintained so that if the need arose, we should be able to take the troops into the line and carry out orders in an emergency. My sphere of action was a sector left of Saint-Pierre-Vaast wood and immediately in front of the so-called Nameless wood. The first night, after nearly drowning myself in crossing a marsh flooded by the Tortil, I got into a thick cloud of phosgene shell gas and scurried back with weeping eyes to Vaux Wood. On the way back, I fell into one shell hole after another, as I could see nothing through the misted eyepieces of the mask. On the 13th November, hoping for better luck, I set out again on my second tour of the line. My orders were to ascertain that touch was maintained between the shell holes that constituted the front line. I struggled to my goal along a chain of posts concealed in holes on the ground. The shell hole line deserved its name. A plateau in front of the village of Roncourt was pockmarked with innumerable miniature craters which here and there were occupied by 2 or 3 men. The monotony of the scene, where nothing was heard but the whistle and crash of shells, filled the mind with the dread of its utter desolation. After some time, I lost touch with the line of shell holes and went back in case I walked into the French. Soon after, I came upon an officer I knew in the 164th Regiment, who warned me not to stay any longer now that dawn was breaking. So I hurried on through Nameless Wood, stumbling into deep shell holes and over uprooted trees and through the almost impassable tangle of branches that covered the ground. When I left the edge of the wood, it was daylight. Before me lay an expanse of shell holes without a sign of life. I stopped short, for in modern battles, stretches of ground where not a man is to be seen are always suspicious. Suddenly, a shot from an unseen sniper got me in both legs. I flung myself into the nearest shell hole and bound the wounds with my handkerchief, for, needless to say, I had forgotten my field dressing. A bullet had passed through my right calf and grazed my left. I crept back into the wood with the utmost caution and from there limped over the shell-shot ground to the dressing station. Shortly before this, I had an example of the little incidents on which the chances of war turn. I was making for the crossroads about 100 meters ahead of me when an officer in command of a working party whom I had known in the 9th Company called out to me. We had scarcely been talking for a minute when a shell struck the crossroads where, but for this chance encounter, I should probably have been at that very moment. After dark, I was carried on a stretcher to Noirlou. Captain Böckelmann was kindly waiting for me with a car. We were proceeding along the chaussee in the light of the enemy searchlights when the driver suddenly applied the brakes. A dark obstruction barred the way. It was an infantry section with its NCO, which had just fallen victim to a direct hit. It seemed as though death had united them in a peaceful sleep. I had to be taken into the cellar of the priest's house, as Lieremont was just receiving its evening benediction. The same evening I was moved to the Villeray field hospital and thence to the war hospital at Valenciennes. The hospital was installed in the gymnasium near the station and accommodated 400 severe cases. A funeral procession with muffled drums left the main entrance day after day. The whole mystery of the war was concentrated in the spacious operating theatre. The surgeons carried on their sanguinary trade at a row of operating tables. Here a limb was amputated, there a skull chiseled away, or a grown-in bandage cut out. Moans and cries of pain sounded through the room in a flood of remorseless light, while nurses in white hastened busily from one table to another with instruments and dressings. The soldier who after such a sight goes back under fire with ardor unquenched has indeed withstood a test of nerve, for every fresh and terrible impression claws itself into the brain and is added to the prostrating complex of imaginings that make the moment between the rush and the burst of a shell even more frightful. Next to my bed, a sergeant major who had lost a leg lay dying. In his last moments, he woke from delirium and got the nurse to read him his favorite chapter of the Bible. Then, in a voice scarcely audible, he asked all his ward companions to forgive him for having so often awakened them from sleep by his delirious ravings. And then, just before he died a few minutes later, he tried to cheer us all up with an imitation of our orderly's comic dialect. I was glad when after 14 days I was able to leave this abode of piled-up agonies, with my wound half healed. I had read with pride, meanwhile, of the magnificent and successful attack of the Fusiliers on Saint-Pierre-Vaast Wood. The 111th Division was still holding the same front. There were several explosions as my brain trundled into Epéhy. The ruins of goods trucks lumped together showed that it was no joking matter. "What's going on here?" I say, asked a captain sitting opposite me. He had the fresh and rosy air of having been exported straight from home. Without wasting time by a reply, I tore open the door and took cover behind the railway embankment. Fortunately, they were the last ones and only a few horses were wounded. As I could not walk very well, I was given the post of observation officer. My field of observation was over the falling ground between Norlou and Moirlaine. I had a periscopic telescope built into a shelter, and with this I kept the lookout in the front line that I already knew well. My job was to ring up the division in case of heavy fire, colored lights, or any other unusual events. All day long I crouched freezing on a chair behind the glasses in the November mist, with nothing to vary the monotony except an occasional call to test the wires. If the wire had been broken, I had to have it mended by my breakdown squad. Apart from this, I had nothing to do but wait for the moment of an attack. The modern battlefield is like a huge sleeping machine with innumerable eyes and ears and arms lying hidden and inactive, ambushed for the one moment on which all depends. Then, from some hole in the ground, a single red light ascends in fiery prelude. 1,000 guns roar out on the instant, and at a touch, driven by innumerable levers, the work of annihilation goes pounding on its way. Orders fly like sparks and flashes over a close network, spurring on to heightened destruction in front and brining up from behind a steady scream of fresh men and fresh materials to fling into the flames. Everyone feels that he is caught in a vortex which draws him on and thrusts him with unrelenting precision over the brink of death. Every 24 hours I was relieved by another officer and betook myself to Norlou, where fairly comfortable quarters had been rigged up in a large wine cellar. I often think of those long, meditative November evenings which I spent smoking my pipe alone at the hearth of this barrel-shaped vault, while outside the mist dripped from the bare trees in the park and, at long intervals, a re-echoing broke the stillness. On the 18th November, the division was relieved, and I went back to the regiment, now on rest in the village of Fresnoy-le-Grand. There, I took over the command of the 2nd Company in place of Lieutenant Boye, then on leave. The regiment had 4 weeks of undisturbed rest in Fresnoy, and everyone did his best to enjoy it to the full. Christmas and New Year were celebrated by the companies with great festivities at which beer and grog flowed in rivers. There were exactly 4 men left in the 2nd Company who had spent the previous Christmas with me in the line before Monchy. I was billeted on a French rentier in whose house I shared the so-called salon and 2 bedrooms with Fähnrich Gornig and my brother Fritz, who was spending 6 weeks with the regiment as cadet. We made ourselves very merry over the worthy married couple who kept an Argus-eyed watch over their plush furniture and alabaster vases and over their stack of wood in the yard, and who lived on terms of ceaseless animosity with the Batman. In this little retreat the bottle went round faster than ever. At night, when walking late through the narrow streets, one heard the sounds of carnival in every billet. Everything in wartime goes without reckoning, and hence came the preference of the soldier at the front for alcohol in its most concentrated forms. Our relations with the civilian population too were to a great extent of an undesirable familiarity, Venus-deprived mass of many servants. Needless to say, we were at once put on a footing of old Prussian discipline, and it said a great deal for officers and men that after 14 days the regiment was once more at its old level. There was an inspection by the commander of the division, Major General Sonntag. On this occasion, the regiment was honored for its valiant conduct in the attack on Vaast wood and distinguished by a number of decorations. As I marched past the general at the head of the second company, I observed that Colonel von Oppen appeared to make some remark about me to the general. A few hours later, I received orders to report at divisional headquarters, where the general handed me the Iron Cross of the first class. On the 17th January 1917, I was sent from Fresnois on a 4 weeks company commander's course at Sisson near Laon, where there was a French maneuvering ground. Captain Funk, who was in command of the detachment, made the work exceedingly pleasant. He understood to an exceptional degree how to put the spirit above the letter and to interest us in the matters in hand. The catering was certainly the sorriest I had ever experienced in the course of the war. During the whole 4 weeks, there was seldom anything put on the table of our gigantic mess room but watery boiled swedes. At the same time, the work was by no means light. Chapter 9. The Somme Retreat. On my return to the regiment, which had for some days been in the line near the ruins of Villers-Carbonel, I was given temporary command of the 8th Company. Our rest place was Devise. On the march from there to the line, one had to cross the plain of the Somme near the villages of Brie and Saint-Christ. The dreary devastation of these places in the midst of the melancholy marsh country used to put me in a peculiarly sorrowful mood as dark fragments of cloud chased across a moonlit sky, and the eerie interplay of light and shadow heightened the impression of chaos. During the latter part of the time, our front was exposed to numerous English attacks connected with the great evacuation of the Somme area, for which we had made the most careful preparations. The enemy raided nearly every morning to ascertain whether we were still there. The following are a few of the experiences of those days. 1st March 1917. During the morning there was great artillery activity owing to the clear weather. In particular, a heavy battery with the help of balloon observation pretty well flattened the section of the trench occupied by No. 3 platoon of my company. In the afternoon, in order to mark up any alteration of the line on my map, I splashed along to No. 3 platoon through the utterly waterlogged, unnamed trench. On the way, I saw a giant yellow sun rush down to the ground, trailing a black streamer behind it. An airman had attacked the unpleasant balloon and shot it down in flames. He got back in spite of a storm of fire. In the evening, Lance Corporal Schnau came to report that he had detected a sound of pickaxes for 4 days past underneath his section's dugout. I forwarded the report and was sent a pioneer detachment with a listening apparatus, but our suspicions were not confirmed. Later, we heard that our whole position had been undermined. On the 5th of March, a patrol approached our trench in the early morning and began to cut our wire. Lieutenant Eisen with a few men hurried off to warn the nearest post and threw bombs. The enemy patrol then took the flight, leaving 2 men behind them. One, a young lieutenant, died immediately, the other, a sergeant, was severely wounded in the arm and leg. It appeared from papers found on the officer that he belonged to the Royal Munster Fusiliers. He was very well clothed, and his features, though distorted in death, were intelligent and energetic. It affected me to find the addresses of several London girls in his pocketbook. We buried him behind our trench and put a simple cross at his head. I saw from this that all patrols need not end so fortunately as mine had done in days past. Next morning, the English, after a short artillery preparation, attacked the front of the company commanded by Lieutenant Reinhardt with 50 men. The enemy crept up to the wire. Then one of them, who had a striker attached to his cuff, made a light signal in order to silence the English machine guns, and the whole party threw their last bombs and advanced on the trench. The men received them in such a masterful fashion that only one of them got into the trench. He ran straight through to the second line, and there, when he made no reply to summons to give himself up, he was shot. Only a lieutenant and a sergeant got through the wire. The officer, though he wore a steel shirt under his uniform, was accounted for by a bullet point-blank from Reinhardt's revolver that drove the whole steel plate into his body. The sergeant had both legs nearly torn off by a bomb. Nevertheless, he clenched his short pipe between his teeth with stoical calm until he died. Here, as always, whenever we encountered the English, we encountered brave men. During the morning of this success, I was strolling through the trench and saw Lieutenant Pfaffendorf, who was controlling the fire of his trench mortar with a periscopic telescope from a fire step. I had scarcely joined him when I saw an Englishman walking along over the top behind the third line of the enemy trenches. I seized the nearest rifle, sighted it at 600, got the man in the tip of the foresight, and then, aiming a bit in front of his head, pulled the trigger. He went 3 steps and then fell on his back as though his legs had been knocked from under him. After a few movements of his arms, he rolled into a shell hole where, with the glass, we could see his brown sleeves showing up for a long while after. On the 9th of March, our front was properly plastered with shells. I was awakened in the early morning by the heavy firing and, seizing my revolver, went, dazed with sleep, into the trench. When I pulled aside the ground sheet at the top of the dugout steps, it was still as black as pitch. The bright flashes of the guns and the showers of earth woke me up in no time. I ran through the trenches, but not a soul did I see till I came to a deep dugout where a group of men crowded on the steps like hens crowding together in the rain with no one in command. On such occasions the Prussian way is the best. Pitch into the men and so get yourself going too. I took them with me and soon made the trench look lively. I was delighted to hear little Hamburg's piping voice somewhere along the trench, occupied in the same way I was. When the firing died down, I went back to my dugout in a bad temper, and there I was further ruffled by a telephone call from headquarters. "Why have you been all this time coming to the phone?" Keeping in touch is no doubt most important, but fighting, after all, is action first and last. After breakfast there was more of it. This time HEs were slowly but incessantly being plonked down in front of our noses. At last it became boring, so I paid little Hamburg a visit by an underground gallery, and after seeing what he had to drink, sat down with him to a game of 7 and 4, where we were a little upset once by a giant crash. It sounded as though a drunken gang came tumbling over each other down the steps. Lumps of earth clattered through the door and down the stovepipe. The dugout shaft had got hit, and the timber revetment was shivered to matchwood. Sometimes a suffocating smell of bitter almonds blew down the shaft. Were they shooting prussic acid at us? Well, good luck to them. I had to leave the dugout once. Indeed, I made 4 attempts in all, owing to constant interruption by the shells. Immediately after, the Batman bounced in with the announcement that the latrine had disappeared beneath a direct hit. "Well," said Hamburg, "you do have the devil's own luck." The fire ceased towards evening. I went along the trench in the mood I always experienced after being heavily shelled, a mood like the relief one feels after a violent storm. The trench looked pretty bad. Stretches of it were entirely filled in. 5 dugout shafts were smashed up. Several men were wounded. I went to see them and found them all fairly comfortable. There was 1 man killed. His body lay in the trench covered with a ground sheet. A long splinter had torn his left hip away, though he was standing right at the bottom of the dugout steps. In the morning we were relieved. On the 13th I was entrusted by Colonel von Oppen with the honorable task of holding the company front with a patrol of 2 sections until the whole regiment had crossed the Somme. Each of the 4 sectors of our front was to be held by a similar patrol under the command of an officer. The officers starting from the right flank were Reinhard, Fischer, Lorek and myself. The villages we passed through as we marched to the front line had the appearance of lunatic asylums let loose. Whole companies were pushing walls down or sitting on the roofs of houses, throwing down the slates. Trees were felled, window frames broken, and smoke and clouds of dust rose from heap after heap of rubbish. In short, an orgy of destruction was going on. The men were chasing round with incredible zeal, arrayed in the abandoned wardrobes of the population, in women's dresses and with top hats on their heads. With positive genius they singled out the main beams of the houses and, tying ropes around them, tugged with all their might, shouting out in time with their pulls till the whole house collapsed. Others swung hammers and smashed whatever came in their way, from flower pots to the window ledges to the glasswork of conservatories. Every village up to the Siegfried line was a rubbish heap. Every tree felled, every road mined, every well fouled, every watercourse dammed, every cellar blown up or made into a death trap with concealed bombs, all supplies or metal sent back, all rails ripped up, all telephone wire rolled up, everything burnable burned. In short, the country over which the enemy were to advance had been turned into an utter desolation. The moral justification of this has been much discussed. However, it seems to me that the gratified approval of armchair warriors and journalists is incomprehensible. When thousands of peaceful persons are robbed of their homes, the self-satisfaction of power may at least keep silence. As for the necessity, I have of course as a Prussian officer no doubt whatever. War means the destruction of the enemy without scruple and by any means. War is the harshest of all trades, and the masters of it can only entertain humane feelings so long as they do no harm. It makes no difference that these operations, which the situation demanded, were not very pretty. On the 13th, I took over with my 2 sections the front that the 2nd Company now left to me. During the night, a man with the ominous name of Kirchhoff was killed by a shot through the head. This unlucky shot happened to be the only one fired by the enemy during several hours. I did all I could to deceive the enemy as to our strength. A few shovelfuls of earth were thrown over the top, now at one point, now at another, and our machine gun had to fire a few shots first from the left and then from the right. Nevertheless, our fire sounded extremely thin when a low-flying scout crossed the line or a working party traversed our front behind the enemy's trenches. Consequently, patrols appeared every night at one point or another and set to work tampering with our wire. On the last day but one, I nearly met a sorrowful end. A Dutch shell from an anti-aircraft gun came hurtling down and exploded on the traverse against which I was innocently leaning. The rush of air sent me flying into the entrance of a deep dugout exactly opposite, where I came to in a state of utter stupefaction. On the 17th, in the early morning, we could tell that an attack was imminent. In the English front line, usually unoccupied due to the mud, was to be heard the clatter of many feet. The laughter and shouting showed that they were a strong party and well fortified from within. Presently dark figures approached our wire. They dispersed under our fire, and one collapsed with a cry and was left behind. I withdrew my men to the entrance of the communication trench and was kept busy in illuminating our front, now suddenly under artillery and trench mortar fire, with very lights. As the white soon gave out, we made a fireworks display with colored ones. When 5 o'clock came, the hour at which, according to orders, we were to evacuate the trench, we quickly blew up the dugouts with bombs, insofar as they were not already provided with infernal machines, some of which we had ingeniously constructed. During the last hours, I had not dared to touch any box or door or bucket in case I might go up in the air. At the appointed time, all the patrols, some of them already involved in bombing engagements, retreated towards the Somme. We were the last to cross the river, and then the bridges were blown up by an engineer detachment. The drum fire still raged away on our front, and it was some hours later when the first enemy patrols appeared on the Somme. We retired behind the Siegfried position, then still being constructed. The battalion was quartered in the village of Léaucourt on the Saint-Quentin Canal. I occupied with my batmen a comfortable little cottage where household goods were stored away in chests and cupboards. I should like to put on record to show what sort of fellows ours were, that nothing I could say would induce my batman, the trusty Knigge, to make his bed in the warm sitting room. He insisted all the time on sleeping in the cold kitchen. This attitude of reserve, which is typical of the Lower Saxon, made the relations between officers and men work very smoothly. The first evening out on rest, I invited a party of my fellow officers to drink mulled wine, spiced with all the spices left behind by the owner of the house, for our rearguard had earned the praise of all our superior officers and 14 days' leave as well.
And another episode where our man gets extremely lucky multiple times. Once, he stops to have a chat with an acquaintance while the crossroads he was about to walk on received a direct hit. Then he gets shot in both legs but manages to recuperate pretty quickly. He also gets thrown about a bit by a shell without much effect again. But seeing what he experienced in the field hospital, I bet that he was not very keen on going there another time. Then there is his claimed 600-meter shot on an English soldier. Now, if you read contemporary authors critiquing his book, this is something that gets mentioned most of the time. And while he does not directly claim that he hit the man, it is heavily implied. I can tell you this much, hitting a moving target at 600 meters with iron sights is practically a superhuman achievement. I'm not saying that he did not do it, but I find it quite unlikely. To give you some context, I myself qualified as expert with the rifle in the US Army marksmanship exam, a qualification which I enjoyed very much actually, where I had to hit a variety of targets at distances from 50 up to 300 meters with iron sights. It was way more challenging than the German equivalent, by the way, but that's another story. Anyway, hitting man-sized targets with iron sights at 300 meters was doable, but twice the distance, that would be quite a feat. And while German marksmanship training at the time was pretty good, it would still be one hell of a shot. So make your own judgment. What is undisputable, however, is the death of the young British lieutenant that he personally witnessed. That was Lieutenant O.C. Stokes of the Royal Munster Fusiliers. He died on March 5, 1917, and he was 19 years old. Jünger had a small wooden cross constructed for him, and while there is no image of said cross, there is a sketch in his diary which I will put on screen. It is apparent that the man's death impacted Jünger somewhat, as he realized that not every patrol may end in glory or victory. And finally, he's part of the retreat from the Somme. I've talked about this specific battle in the last episode, and now the Imperial German Army is retreating to a fallback position. We will see how the war continues from there in the next episode. Cheers.